All right, let's dive in. We've got a mountain of reports here from Stats SA, all about the South African CPI. And I know, sometimes those reports can feel like they're written in a whole other language.
Yeah, like trying to decipher hieroglyphics or something.
Exactly. But the thing is, hidden in all those numbers is a really fascinating story about what's happening to prices in South Africa.
It's like a financial health checkup for the whole country, It tells us whether the cost of living is going up, down, or just kind of doing its own thing.
So basically, if you've ever wondered how inflation is impacting your wallet, this deep dive is for you. We'll break down how the CPI is calculated, what actually goes into it, and why it matters to you. First things first, though, what is the CPI actually used for?
Well, there are actually three main uses. The first is macroeconomic policy, which is basically a fancy way of saying how the government manages the economy.
Okay.
Like when the South African Reserve Bank uses CPI data to make decisions about interest rates, the things that affect like your bond repayments and stuff.
So the CPI is like a secret weapon for the folks trying to keep the economy on track. But it's not just for the bigwigs and policymakers, is it? I mean, this affects all of us,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. It's also used to ensure fairness.
Fairness?
Yeah, fairness.
Right.
Because the CPI is used to adjust wages and salaries, to make sure they're keeping up with rising prices.
Right.
It's also used to adjust grants and even long-term contracts to make sure they stay in line with the cost of living.
So it's like a referee making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Yeah.
And what's that third use you mentioned?
The third use is for analyzing consumer spending.
Okay.
So by using the CPI to adjust for inflation, economists can see how spending patterns are really changing over time,
So it's like an X-ray vision for the economy.
pretty much.
Okay, cool. But before we get too deep into the numbers, I'm curious about the history of the CPI here in South Africa. How long has this thing been around?
The South African CPI actually goes all the way back to 1911.
Yeah.
That's over a century of tracking price changes.
Yeah. I can't even imagine what the data collection process was like back then.
Well, at first it was pretty centralized,
Race.
lots of reliance on snail mail.
It's a nail mail.
But in 2006, they made a big shift towards direct collection.
Okay.
So, they have price collectors physically visiting stores all over the country.
Wow.
And then more recently, in 2022 and 2023, they introduced a mobile app for data gathering.
Talk about a tech upgrade.
Right?
So where exactly are they collecting all this data? I mean, is it just the big cities or what?
No, it's a lot more comprehensive than that. They cover both urban and rural areas across all 9 provinces.
So it's a pretty accurate snapshot of what's happening to prices all over South Africa, not just in a few cities.
Exactly. It really reflects the cost of living for households across the entire nation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm.
But I have to ask, is there just one CPI number they release each month? Or is it a bit more nuanced than that?
It's definitely more nuanced. Stats SA actually publishes a whole bunch of different CPI series.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Can you give me an example? What do those different CPI series actually show?
Well, for instance, there's the CPI excluding food and non-alcoholic beverages,
Okay.
and the one excluding fuel and energy, too.
Okay.
Those things can really fluctuate a lot, so by taking them out of the equation, you get a clear picture of what's happening to prices for other goods and services.
So it's like filtering out some of the noise to see those underlying trends.
Exactly. And then there's another series called the Trimmed Mean CPI.
Okay.
This one is calculated by chucking out the extreme price changes, both high and low.
So it's like focusing on those products that have more stable price trends.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
hmm
But with so many products and services out there, how do they decide what to include in the CPI in the first place? Do they just have a giant checklist?
It's a bit more organized than that. They use something called the QI-COP classification system. COI-COP. It stands for Classification of Individual Consumption by Purpose, but you can think of it like a detailed map of everything included in the CPI basket.
Okay, so not a giant checklist, but a super detailed map.
Right.
Gotcha. So how does this Kauai Cop map work?
It breaks down consumer spending into 12 major divisions.
Okay.
Like food and beverages, housing, transport, education, all that stuff.
12 major divisions. I'm guessing not all those categories are created equal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, some things must be more important in the overall CPI calculation than others.
You're absolutely right. That's where the concept of weights comes in.
Weights.
Yeah.
Okay, go on.
Each category in the CPI basket is assigned a specific weight.
Okay.
That weight reflects how important it is in the overall calculation.
So If people spend a lot of their income on housing, for example, changes in housing prices would carry more weight in the CPI than, say, changes in the price of chewing gum.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that these weights aren't static. They shift over time to reflect how people's spending habits are changing.
So it's not just a snapshot in time, but a dynamic measure that evolves with how South Africans are living and spending their money. But how do they actually determine those weights? Is there some secret formula?
The main source is the Income and Expenditure Survey. It's a really detailed survey that Stats SA does to find out how people are spending their money.
Okay.
But they use other sources too, like national accounts data, retail sales figures, and even things like population censuses.
So they're like data detectives, piecing together this picture of spending from multiple sources.
That's a good way to put it.
But with so many products and services on the market, how do they decide what actually goes into the CPI basket? It can't be random, right?
Definitely not random. There are specific criteria a product has to meet.
Okay, spill the tea. What are those criteria?
First, it has to be representative.
Okay.
It can't be some niche product that only a handful of people buy. It has to be something that a significant portion of household are actually purchasing.
So no limited edition designer sneakers in the CPI basket then?
Right. And second, the product has to be purchased regularly. They're not tracking the price of something you only buy once a year.
Okay, makes sense. So what's the third criterion?
The product has to make up a certain percentage of spending within its category. It has to be significant enough to warrant inclusion.
Okay, so it's all about capturing those products that have a real impact on household budgets.
Yeah.
But here's a thought thing about it. The CPI basket isn't set in stone, right? It changes over time as new products come out and old ones fade away.
You're absolutely right. The CPI basket is constantly evolving.
So what are some of the newbies that have made it into the basket recently, and what's been kicked to the curb?
Well, in the 2025 report, you'll see they've added things like eye drops and calming or mood-enhancing treatments to the health category.
Okay.
And self-catering accommodation is a new addition, too.
Interesting. So they're reflecting those shifts towards things like Airbnbs and taking care of our mental well-being. But what about the things that got kicked out? Anything surprising?
Get this, they've removed tampons, hair relaxers, and bubble bath.
No way. Why on earth would they remove those items?
It seems strange, I know, but it all comes down to those criteria we were talking about.
Right.
Maybe those products no longer meet the threshold for representativeness, meaning people aren't spending as much on them as they used to. Or maybe they've been replaced by other products that better reflect current consumer habits.
Okay, so even though those products might feel essential to some people, the data tells a different story about their overall importance in household budgets.
Exactly.
It's a good reminder that the CPI is about capturing the bigger picture, not just individual preferences. But speaking of data, how do they actually collect all those prices? Do they have a secret army of shoppers out there?
Not quite secret shoppers, but they do have two main methods for collecting prices.
Okay, fill me in.
The first is field-based collection. Okay, those price collectors we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They physically visit stores all over the country to record prices.
Right, and they've got that cool mobile app to help them out.
Exactly. And then the second method is head office-based collection. Okay.
This is mostly for services and some goods where prices can be collected remotely.
Okay, so like things you can find online.
Yeah, like internet services or insurance premiums, things like that.
So they're using a combination of old school, boots on the ground methods and those newer digital approaches.
Yeah.
That's clever. But collecting the data is just the first step, right? How do they make sure all those prices are accurate and reliable? I mean, are they just trusting those price collectors to get it right?
They actually have an auditing process to double-check everything.
Okay.
Auditors visit stores to confirm the accuracy of the prices, and they make sure all those price collectors are following the rules.
So it's like a quality control system for the data.
You got it.
That's good to know. But let's be real. In the real world, there are always going to be some missing prices. What happens if they can't find a price for a specific product? Do they just shrug and move on?
Not quite. They use something called imputation to fill those gaps.
Imputation. Okay, that sounds a bit fancy. What is that exactly? It's basically a statistical technique for filling in those missing prices.
Oh.
In a way that tries to minimize bias.
Okay.
Stats SA actually uses two main imputation methods.
Okay, what are those?
For some things, like school fees, which only change once a year, they just hold the index constant in the months when prices aren't collected.
So they just assume the price stays the same until the next update.
Exactly. But for other products, where prices might change more frequently, they use the price changes of similar products to estimate the missing value.
So, like, if they're missing the price of a certain brand of bread, they might look at how the prices of other bread brands have changed to make an educated guess.
Right. It's all about finding the closest possible match to avoid distorting the CPI.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But here's another thought. Products are always changing, right?
Right.
Like, a new phone comes out with a better camera and a longer battery life. How do they account for those quality changes when calculating the CPI? I mean, if the price goes up, but you're getting more for your money, is that really inflation?
That's a really good point. And that's where quality adjustments come into play. They have to make sure they're comparing apples to apples, even when those apples get fancier over time.
Right. It's not fair to compare the price of a basic flip phone to the latest smartphone. They're totally different things.
Exactly. To deal with this, Stats SA uses a method called hedonic regression.
Okay.
It's a way to isolate the part of the price change that's actually due to changes in quality.
So they can separate out the price increase from the value increase.
You got it. They use this for things like cars, phones, and TVs.
Products that get those frequent upgrades.
Exactly.
Okay, I see. But what about those sneaky shrinking products?
Shrinking products.
Yeah, like when you get a smaller bag of chips for the same price. How do they handle those changes in quantity in the CPI?
They use quantity adjustments. So if the quantity of a product changes, they adjust the price accordingly.
So they're on to those sneaky manufacturers. It's good to know someone's watching out for us consumers. But with all this data and analysis going on, where can the average person find this CPI information? Is it locked away in some secret government vault?
Not at all. It's all publicly available on the Stats SA website.
Really?
Yeah, they publish the CPI releases, detailed notes on their methodology, even a publication schedule so you can mark your calendar.
So anyone can have a late-night CPI data party if they want.
Exactly. They're all about transparency.
That's fantastic. So all those reports we were talking about at the beginning are just a click away. But with all those numbers and technical terms, it's easy to get lost in the weeds. Why should the average person even care about the CPI? What's the so what for the listener?
The CPI might seem like just a bunch of numbers, but it actually has a huge impact on all our lives. It affects our salaries, our investments, how much we pay for groceries, even the government's policies.
So understanding the CPI is kind of like having a superpower.
It's like having X-ray vision for the economy, remember?
Right. It helps us make better financial decisions and navigate those economic ups and downs.
Exactly. It's about empowering ourselves with knowledge.
I like it. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to our money. But I have to admit, this is a lot to absorb. I'm still wrapping my head around all the details.
That's understandable. The CPI is complex, but even a basic understanding can make a real difference. And as you go about your day, just think about how these price changes are playing out in your life. Do you notice any patterns in your spending? Or in the things that are getting more or less expensive?
It's like turning those numbers into a real-life story.
Exactly. The CPI isn't just about data, it's about understanding those broader trends shaping our society. It really is fascinating how the CPI can be like a window into what's happening in South Africa.
Totally. And speaking of those changing trends, we talked about those weights in the CPI basket earlier. Could you explain a little bit more about how those are determined and updated? It seems pretty important for making sure the CPI stays accurate over time.
Absolutely. Remember how we talked about those 12 major divisions in the COI-COP system?
Yeah.
Well, each division and even the categories within those divisions are assigned weights based on how much households are spending on those things.
Okay, so if food takes up a bigger chunk of people's budgets compared to, say, entertainment, it would have a heavier weight in the CPI.
Exactly. And the cool thing is that those weights aren't set in stone. They're actually adjusted over time to reflect changes in people's spending habits.
So Stats SA is basically constantly monitoring how people are spending their money and tweaking the CPI to make sure it's staying relevant.
Right.
But how do they know when it's time for a weight update? Is there a schedule, or is it more of a gut feeling?
It's definitely more data-driven than gut feeling.
Okay.
Stats SA uses a ton of information, especially from that income and expenditure survey we mentioned. You know, the one that looks at how households are spending their money.
Right.
And they also look at other data like national accounts, retail sales figures, and even population censuses to get a really complete picture of those spending patterns.
So they're basically looking for any signs that those weights need to be adjusted to keep the CPI accurate.
Precisely.
That's super interesting. It's like the CPI is constantly evolving to keep up with how South Africans are living and spending.
Yeah, it's pretty dynamic.
It is. But I'm kind of curious about how all those individual prices they collect actually get turned into that single CPI number we see every month. It seems kind of magical, taking all that raw data and transforming it into this measure of the cost of living.
There is a bit of magic involved, but it's mostly about those carefully designed statistical methods they use.
Okay, tell me more about this statistical magic show. What are the key steps involved?
Well, the first step is all about creating those elementary price indices. Those are the building blocks of the CPI, representing the price changes for really specific products within each category.
Okay, so like if we were talking about food, there would be a separate elementary price index for bread, another one for milk, another one for meat, and so on.
Exactly. And to calculate those elementary price indices, they use a formula called the Jevons index.
The Jevons index.
Yeah, it's a bit technical, but basically they're calculating a weighted average of the price changes for all those individual products within each category.
So it's not just a simple average of all the prices.
No.
Okay,
It takes into account how important each product is in the overall basket.
right. Because a change in the price of milk is going to have a bigger impact on the overall CPI than a change in the price of, say, a specific brand of candy bar.
Exactly. And then once they've got all those elementary price indices, they move on to the next stage, which is aggregating those lower level price changes into those higher level categories.
So it's like building a pyramid, starting with those individual product price changes at the bottom, and then layering on those broader categories until you reach the top, that single CPI number.
That's a great way to think about it.
And what's the formula they use for that aggregation?
It's called the Young Index.
The Young Index.
Yeah, and again, it's basically a weighted average, but this time it's using those elementary price indices as the inputs.
Okay, so they're taking those lower level price changes, weighting them based on how important each category is, and then combining them to get that overall picture of how prices are changing across the whole economy.
Precisely. But they don't stop there. The next step is chaining those monthly indices together. This creates a continuous flow of data so you can see how those prices have changed over time.
It's like creating a timeline of price changes.
Exactly. It allows you to track how those prices have evolved month by month, not just comparing one point in time to another. And this is super important for understanding how inflation accumulates.
Right, because those small price changes can really add up over time. But what about those weight updates we talked about earlier? How do they fit into this whole chaining process? Doesn't it get messy when you're trying to compare data from different periods with different weights?
That's a great question, and that's where the concept of linking comes in.
Linking?
Yeah, when Stats SA updates those CPI weights, they have to make sure the new index series connects smoothly with the old one so there aren't any weird jumps or breaks in the data.
So they're basically making sure that the transition from the old CPI to the new CPI is seamless.
Exactly. And they do this by rebasing all those indices to a common reference period. So in this case, it would be December 2024. This makes sure that all those indices, both the old ones and the new ones, are aligned at that point in time.
Okay, so it's like synchronizing those different data streams at a specific point in time to create a unified timeline of price changes.
Precisely. And then, starting from January 2025, they calculate the new CPI using those updated weights.
So they're essentially blending the past and the present, ensuring that the CPI reflects both those long-term trends and the current reality of how South Africans are spending their money.
Exactly. It's quite a sophisticated process.
It is. And it's really impressive how much care goes into making sure the CPI data is accurate and reliable. But let's be real for a moment. Even with all these fancy techniques and quality control measures, the CPI can't be a perfect reflection of reality, right?
Yeah, absolutely right.
Okay, good. Just making sure.
It's important to acknowledge the limitations of any statistical measure, and the CPI is no different.
Okay.
For example, it's based on a sample of products and outlets, so it can't capture every single price change that's happening out there.
Right. It's more like a snapshot of what's happening to prices rather than a complete and total picture.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that the CPI is based on an average basket of goods and services.
Okay.
And that basket might not perfectly reflect everyone's individual spending habits.
Right. Like I probably spend way more on coffee than the average person and way less on, I don't know, car maintenance.
Exactly. And another thing to keep in mind is that the CPI doesn't always capture those quality improvements that can come with rising prices.
Okay, like that new phone example we talked about earlier.
Yeah, a new phone might cost more, but it might also have a way better camera, a faster processor, more memory, and a bunch of other features that older phones didn't have.
So the CPI might show inflation in terms of that price increase, but it doesn't necessarily capture that increase in value or functionality.
Right.
It's a good reminder that there's more to the cost of living than just the price tag.
Absolutely. But even with those limitations, the CPI is still a really valuable tool. It gives us insights into those bigger trends and patterns in the economy.
And it helps us make sense of how those price changes are actually affecting our lives.
Exactly. And as we move forward in this deep dive, it's important to keep those limitations in mind while also appreciating the power of the CPI as a tool for understanding how the South African economy is working.
It's amazing how something like the CPI, which seems so technical and abstract, can have such a real impact on our everyday lives.
Right, it's like this hidden force that's always at play, shaping our financial decisions and influencing everything from our salaries to the interest rates we pay on our loans.
And speaking of salaries, I wanted to touch on one of the most important applications of the CPI, its role in adjusting wages and contracts. This is where those abstract numbers really hit home for a lot of people.
Absolutely. The CPI is a crucial tool for ensuring fairness when it comes to compensation. It helps to make sure that people's incomes are keeping pace with those rising prices so they're not losing purchasing power.
So if the CPI is going up, it means the cost of living is increasing, and ideally, wages and contracts would be adjusted to reflect that.
Exactly. A lot of employers actually use the CPI as a guideline when they're figuring out salary increases.
All right.
It helps them to make sure their employees can still afford the same things, even as prices are going up.
And it's not just salaries, right? The CPI is also used to adjust government grants and social benefits.
That's right. Those grants and benefits are often linked to the CPI, so they automatically go up as the cost of living increases.
So it's like a built-in safety net to protect those who are most vulnerable to those rising prices.
Precisely. It helps to ensure that everyone can still afford those basic necessities, even when inflation is putting pressure on household budgets.
Okay, that makes sense. But this principle of indexing to the CPI isn't just for individual incomes, is it? I mean, it's also used for things like rental contracts, right?
Exactly.
Mhm.
If you have a rental contract that's fixed for a few years and inflation goes up during that time, your rent could end up being a lot harder to afford.
Right.
And on the flip side, your landlord might be losing money in real terms.
Because their costs are going up, but the rent is staying the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
But by linking the rent to the CPI, both the tenant and the landlord are protected from those big swings in the economy.
It's like a built-in mechanism to make sure the agreement stays fair over time.
Exactly.
But I'm wondering, are there any potential downsides to indexing everything to the CPI? Could it create a situation where rising prices lead to higher wages, which then lead to even higher prices, and so on?
That's a really good question, and it's definitely something to be mindful of. While indexing can be a great tool, it's important to use it carefully.
Okay.
If it's not done thoughtfully, it could contribute to something called a wage price spiral.
A wage price spiral.
Yeah, that's basically when wages and prices keep chasing each other upwards.
So it can actually make inflation worse.
Right, so it's about finding the right balance, using indexing to protect people's incomes and ensure fairness, but also being careful not to fuel further inflation.
Right. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Exactly.
But shifting gears for a moment, let's talk about the big picture. We talked about inflation targeting earlier and how the South African Reserve Bank uses the CPI to guide its monetary policy decisions. Can you remind us how that works?
Sure. The South African Reserve Bank, or SARB, aims to keep inflation within a certain range currently. That range is between 3% and 6%.
Okay.
They use the CPI to track how inflation is doing, and then they adjust interest rates to try and keep it within that target range.
So if the CPI is showing that inflation's getting too high, the SARB might raise interest rates to cool things down a bit.
Exactly. And if inflation is too low, they might lower interest rates to encourage spending and economic activity.
It's like they're trying to steer the economy, using interest rates as the steering wheel and the CPI as their navigation system.
That's a great analogy. And it really shows how important the CPI is for maintaining a stable and healthy economy.
It's not just about numbers on a page. It's about real people's lives, their jobs, their businesses, their ability to plan for the future.
Right. Understanding the CPI is crucial for anyone who wants to make sense of the economy and make informed financial decisions.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from the nitty-gritty details of how the CPI is calculated all the way to its impact on our everyday lives and the broader economy.
It's been a really fascinating journey exploring this complex but incredibly important economic indicator.
And we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the South African CPI. We hope you've learned something new and maybe even developed a bit of a CPI superpower.
Exactly. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating the economic landscape.
And on that note, be sure to join us next week as we take a deep dive into last year's South African Financial Budget 2024 in preparation for Budget 2025. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring.